Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Cheryl Harris. I'm faculty director of this Critical Race Studies program. I'm a professor here at UCLA School of Law, and I really want to say happy Valentine's Day to all of you. We really want to thank everyone who's played a role in putting this program together and show our love for the Bunch Center of African American Studies, the Black Law Students Association, and our own Jasleen Coley, program director for the Critical Race Studies program, who has borne a lot of the labor and war in pulling this together. So I want to thank everyone for that. I think it's really fitting that we have this program on Valentine's Day so that we can show our love for a segment of the population in LA that has not often been at the center of our attention, and that is black workers, and particularly black workers in Los Angeles. We all may have observed that the precarious situation for workers has become a standard part of the political rhetoric. You know, everybody wants to say that they're all about getting people jobs. And many people claim to have the issue of jobs and work at the center of their political project. But the gap between these promises and the reality being the inability to obtain stable, decent, wage-paying work that does not require people to risk their health or to denigrate their humanity by coercing them to accept intolerable working conditions, be that demanding sexual favors or otherwise. It's true more broadly, that is this problem, this crisis around work, but it has a particular shape and form when it intersects with the issue of race. Black people's labor has been and continues to be both foundational and undervalued. It's stolen in the past and exploited in the present, both through different forms. Historically, though, at the same time, black people and black workers have been at the forefront of resistance. As W.B. Du Bois' classic Black Reconstruction begins, he begins his story not with a chapter called Slaves, but with a chapter called The Black Worker. And he describes the crucial role of the black worker in winning the Civil War by what he describes as, quote, the general strike. The general strike he's referring to is the way in which black workers fled the plantation, withdrawing their labor from the plantation system and helping to precipitate its collapse. Our speakers here today represent some of the clearest voices to help us think through how and in what ways the conditions of black workers here in Los Angeles and in the region reveal important stories that have much to teach us about law and the struggle for justice, and about what it means to once again be in the forefront of resistance. Our speakers are uniquely qualified to speak to this question, and as you will see from the bios that should be available, because time is tight, I'd ask that you consult the printed bios for more detail, as I'm just going to make a brief introduction. There is one bio that did not make it to the printed materials, and I apologize for that. Some of this just had to do with the production schedule for getting this out, and that is Castro Landers, who will be our third speaker. And Castro is a worker. He works for Amtrak, has been working for over 30 years there. Currently a conductor, I believe. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we're going to hear from Castro. Again, apologies for not having that information on the bio. Because time is tight, I've asked the speakers to just make some opening remarks, and then once they've had a chance to go around once, then hopefully we'll get the conversation going. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Noah Zatz. Noah is, as the bio reflects, a professor here at UCLA. We are very, very honored to have him on this panel. He's been working a lot on the question of race and class and work. Next will be Lola Smallwood-Cuevas, who is the director and founder, I believe, of the Black Worker Center. I've mentioned Castro, and then finally, certainly last but not least, our very own Delvin Turner, who is a joint public policy master's and JD, who has been working with the center over the last year and a half.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on Valentine's Day with this community of colleagues and students that I love. So my job here is to get us from the NFL to the Crenshaw line, or to put it another way, to try to briefly situate the amazing work being done by the LA Black Worker Center within the national landscape of the politics of race and work. So let me start by just kind of putting out there three basic interrelated ideas that I think are central to a critical analysis of race and labor. So first, work is political. Second, race is political. Third, work is racialized. Nice short sentences. All right, so when I say that work is political, I want to capture three related ideas. First, perhaps most obvious and familiar, is that we have political arguments and decisions about how work is structured, whether to pass a minimum wage law, whether to resist international trade agreements because of their effects on U.S. workers, and so on. Among other things, these are questions about the ways in which work is a key site for political arguments about economic distribution of income and jobs. Second, work is also political in a more micro sense, which is that workplaces are structured by power and are places where people experience power, both their own and others. So, employers exercise power to tell workers what to do and not to do. They boss them around, right? And workers, especially when acting collectively, assert their voice in how they are treated at work and how work gets done. And then thirdly, work is political in the sense that someone's status in relationship to work often grounds their claims to citizenship in the broad, non-technical sense of membership and voice in the political community. So you can see that if you think about common claims grounded in assertions like "we built this country" or "hardworking Americans" and so forth, which are claims to political standing and voice grounded in relationship to work and production. And you might think about how those kinds of claims are related to, or sometimes grounded in, or even opposed to, other sorts of claims like taxpayers, right? Paying taxes is a ground for claims, or creating jobs, right? Job creators, that sort of thing. So thinking about work as thoroughly political runs contrary to a standard liberal ideology that treats work as a matter of market economics that stand apart from and ideally unregulated by the political sphere of government. So you see people drawing on that ideology when, in response to actions by workers that are seen as political, they articulate their opposition by saying, "do your job," right, instead of. Now, that's the idea there, is that your job is separate from your politics, and it's an idea that I'll note is invoked both against Colin Kaepernick and other NFL players kneeling as part of the anthem protests, and from different places in the political spectrum, against Kim Davis, the Kentucky clerk who refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, who was also told to do her job. So you see that same basic ideology actually used in very different political ways. Now, the seeming paradox arises when you think about the president incorporating into his political identity the idea that black NFL players should stay out of politics, right? In politics and out of politics at the same time. That's less strange, however, if you incorporate the idea that race is political. And this is in tension with liberal analysis of race purely in terms of difference or discrimination. That's a framework that incorporates the kind of symmetry that is reflected in anti-affirmative action jurisprudence. So this is why it's important to talk not only about racism in the abstract, but about white supremacy specifically, a political relationship structured by and structuring race in a specific hierarchy. So in that vein, Trump and his followers' freak out over the anthem protests makes sense because they challenged white supremacy at multiple levels. Not only with regard to the issue of racialized police violence that was the initial target, but also with regard to the power relations at work between the players and the owners, including the collective action by the players. This is how the generic liberal idea of "do your job" became articulated to the specifically white supremacist hostility to black people asserting power both as workers and as citizens. So the argument that I contributed to a recent op-ed that some people saw, co-authored with Ben Sachs, about the anthem protests, was that it was insufficient to adopt a race-neutral labor law lens focusing purely on worker collective action. Instead, we need to attend to the way that hostility to worker collective action was mediated both by the racial content of the object of protest, police violence, and by the racial position of the subjects, the black workers, who protested. And this racial aspect of the backlash against workplace protest brings in the tools of employment discrimination law, which I won't talk about in detail, but have written about elsewhere. So a related racial dimension of the NFL controversy was the repeated invocation of the idea that the players, by protesting, were being ungrateful. Right? And again, implicit in this critique was a dynamic in which professionally successful white people are glorified for their skill and hard work, even if their last name is Romney or Trump and they had a very rich daddy. While, on the other hand, the success of black people is treated as a favor done for them by white people, to whom they should be grateful for allowing them to rise above their natural station. So if work is political and race is political, it should be no surprise that work is racialized. And this stands in contrast with the well-established way of talking about U.S. politics that treats class, and specifically the condition of workers, as distinct from race. But instead, ideas about who gets to work, why people don't have work when they don't, and how work should be organized when people do have it, these are all structured by race and integrated with the political status of the racialized subject, the worker. So part of what is so exciting and important about the Black Worker Center's work is that it centers black work and black workers. And this cuts against the grain of talk about work and working people that in its ostensible colorblindness actually presumes whiteness. Relatedly, talk about work and working people that by focusing specifically on immigrant workers not only aligns the ways in which immigration politics themselves are thoroughly racialized, but also risks reproducing the idea of black people as non-workers, which is itself part of the historical denial of black citizenship, notwithstanding the history of black work, including slavery. So finally, one of the things that I admire about the Black Worker Center is the way that it focuses simultaneously on access to jobs in the first place, problems of unemployment and access to work, and on the politics of racial inclusion once people are on the job. And this connects deeply to crucial, central critical race theory themes about the politics of inclusion, which we have seen play out in the NFL episodes as the idea that the price of inclusion should be grateful subordination. And so I'll stop there and look forward to learning more from my co-panelists.
Lola?
Okay. Thank you so much, Noah. That was a great framework for the conversation. And I want to just start by saying a word of thanks to all of you for spending your lunch with us, and also for the organizers. I want to recognize, as you know them, as great academic scholars, both Noah and Cheryl. At the Worker Center, we know them as active agents of change who roll up their sleeves. It's not about the research papers on the shelf, but about the research that's on the streets and that's actionable. And there have been so many times that they have come to the support of our work. And I just want to give them, and you all help me give them a round of applause. I'd like to bring our ancestors into the space, Thurgood Marshall, Ella Baker, Martin Luther King. We also, though, want to bring in some of those folks who are embodying the work of our ancestors. And I want to lift up some of the law students, like Brother Delvin, who's here on the panel. I want to lift up Emerson and Kelly and Catherine. These are just some of the aspiring lawyers who have spent time at the Black Worker Center. They now are in their legal careers. We're still in contact with them, but have given so much to not just lifting up worker stories, but being able to validate the experiences that Black workers have in the workplace and make the legal arguments that force folks to listen. You talked a lot about the history and the framework and the intersection of race and capitalism and what it means in the lives of workers. And our families know this every day. Part of the reason why I'm on this panel and I'm proud to be a project director at the UCLA Labor Center that helped to incubate the Black Worker Center. I'm extremely proud to be one of the co-founders of the Black Worker Center because I grew up with a single mom. My mother worked 2 jobs and went to school. I didn't really see my mother until I was like a junior in high school, when she had finally, worked as a CNA, took care of white families in the suburbs on the weekends, and then she put herself through nursing school and finally became an RN, but by that time I was pretty much an adult. And too often, I just realized that, Black families, we have to choose between making a family and making a living. And these are just inhumane decisions and choices that people should not have to make. And now that I have my own children, I'm reflecting on not just my mother's experience, but how many other Black families through a legacy of slavery, which is really the first globalized economy, capitalist global movement, that through the legacy of slavery, we've always, from the auction block to our fathers not being able to live in our homes because of public housing laws, to Norplant, to mass incarceration that separates families. Our families have always been under this crisis, and it's not just about race, it's about race and economy. And so at the Black Worker Center, our work has been to really center the intersections of race and capitalism, and to look at the ways that we really tip the balance of power. How do we build Black political power around the issues of work? How do we tilt that balance of power more in the direction of workers and out of the hands of employers, so that workers have the opportunity to say, what kind of working conditions do they want to work in? What kind of conditions should mandate their hiring? What kind of conditions should govern a separation? That workers themselves should be at the table and be part of that decision making. And the Black Worker Center is now a 7-year-old grassroots action center that is located on Crenshaw Boulevard. Let's see a hands in the air for folks who've been on Crenshaw Boulevard, who've visited. Up high, okay. If you didn't know, that's LA's Black downtown. And if you haven't been there, I suggest you get there, because there are a lot of forces that are pressing on this Black community, pressing in terms of gentrification, displacement, banishment. We need everyone to think about ways to preserve Black space and Black community. And the way we do that is through ensuring people have quality work. So I want to sort of transition and talk a little bit about what we do at the Worker Center. As Noah laid out this issue around the NFL and these well-paid workers, we are focusing around low-wage workers, right? Over 50% of Black workers in Los Angeles County, working age adults, either don't have jobs, meaning they're unemployed or discouraged, no longer on the employment rolls, or they're working poor, right? Meaning that they're in jobs that are paying under $13 an hour. And so when you look at the unemployment and underemployment, it's a dual crisis. We talk a lot about unemployment, but it really is a dual crisis. And at the Worker Center, what we basically do is we address the trauma of what it means when you are the last person hired, what it means when you're the first person fired, what it means when you stand up to defend your rights on the job because you have been discriminated against and you are retaliated and fired. What does it mean when an employer steals your wages? You've done good work and not paid for it. And so our work centers around building up Black workers to, one, know what their rights are, to come together and share their life experience and put that together into a wealth of knowledge that can really ground not just telling the story of the problems, but what are the real time, real live solutions that can make a difference in workers' lives. And we've done that in a number of different ways. And I saw I have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to sort of summarize some of our strategies. One, we're just building relationships with workers. We're organizing. We're talking to workers, we're sharing experiences, we're talking about the ways in which Black workers not internalize what's happening to them, because when you hear the right wing and Donald Trump, it's like you're poor and it's your fault. But what we do is, how do we take a step back and really illuminate the systems? How do we illuminate the root causes so that workers can then take themselves out of feeling responsible for this crisis, which looks the same in LA, it looks the same in Mississippi, it looks the same in Chicago, and really think about, well, how do we change these structures, right? So we look at reforming structures to deal with, like, what are the short-term fixes, policy, learnings, recommendations, solutions, corporate practice changes changes that we can do to improve the lives of workers, but then what are the long-term, the real long-term, more transformational work that not just one, two, but thousands of workers can create together. And we know that we've seen this happen before in our community, where Black working class folks have come together and transformed society. And we've seen that happen here in small victories, but victories of workers coming together, for example, in the construction industry, and passing one of the largest project labor agreements in the country, and the Black Worker Center members ensuring that that policy had strong affirmative action language here in California, where affirmative action is illegal, but really forcing the federal government to step in, where Black workers required that there be higher local hire requirements, meaning instead of just setting aside 30% jobs for local residents, we set aside 40% local jobs for local residents. And then we implemented an oversight model that's brought contractors and workers and the agency to the table to ensure that Black workers were fairly represented in the workforce. And it was the combination of those things that have made a difference. And I will close by saying that, you know, policy is one way to create change. Our vision is a political transformation of the system, and it begins with workers like Castro Landers, who is going to speak next. Castro is a member of the Black Worker Center. He came to us and he will share his experience, but he has shared his testimony across the state and really was a leader in a campaign that we launched last year to expand civil rights protections for all workers at the local level. And so I will turn it over to Castro, and maybe we could talk more about those campaigns later.
All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is still new to me. I thought I was going to speak on a panel without an audience, but I'm glad everybody's here. I'm Castro Landers. I work at Amtrak. I've been working there for over 30 years. My experience with discrimination, I went to work one day, and on the switch pole, they hung up a black doll by the neck. I reported that incident. When it happened, I thought about my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who was born in 1900, about how when she was raising her 3 kids and she thought that maybe her son would be one of those hanging from a tree. So that brought back that feeling. But when I reported it, nothing was done. To this day, that happened in '98. This is 2018. Nothing has been done. I'm still involved in the class action lawsuit that's been going on for 18 years. I came to the Black Workers Center speaking with a friend. I was about to give up because I was just tired of fighting. And with the Black Workers Center, it was a stepping stone for me, so they gave me the strength to continue. And also when I heard I was gonna give up again, but when I heard the Me Too movement, I said, well, that means I gotta keep speaking until eventually someone listens and someone does something about that. In my craft in Los Angeles, I've trained 9 supervisors, but to this day, there is not one Black supervisor in my craft. I'm never qualified. I saved a woman's baby from being kidnapped last year. No recognition for that. Because I'm speaking out, they want to nitpick and find anything wrong to put me down or to get rid of me. But I'm still here. And that's my story so far.
I just want to thank Lola for being here, and Castro for sharing his story, and Professor Zatz and Harris and Jesleen for orchestrating this. Hearing his story really reminded me of the importance of how important it is to approach this work that we're doing in sort of an unorthodox way. I think in law school, you're really trained to see problems very narrowly, and you try to fit your practice of law into the way that lawyers traditionally practice. But in working with underserved communities and low-wage communities, that doesn't really work. It doesn't really create the type of change that we want to see. And it wasn't until I sort of took a step back after a few weeks of working and interacting with clients at BWC that I thought it was more important to be a collaborator with clients as opposed to the traditional lawyer. And it was important to try to collaborate with clients because I needed to understand their stories outside of what the law said their stories was because of the doctrinal framework. And so being a collaborator allowed them to open up to me in ways that they wouldn't traditionally open up to other attorneys, especially because there's just a deep-seated mistrust of the law because the law has historically failed people from their circumstances. And then serving as a collaborator with clients at BWC and with community members also allowed me to help them problem solve in ways that fix their situations how they wanted them to be fixed. And what I mean by that is that I think law school teaches you that there's sort of only one or two right ways to approach a circumstance and that the law may be one of the only mechanisms to effectuate change. But in reality, these clients are dealing with circumstances that require more attention and that require more tools than just the law can provide. And so I think collaborating with clients allowed me to sort of propose solutions that may not have fit within what it means to be like a traditional attorney. For instance, I couldn't tell someone, oh, just file a complaint with DFEH and then sue the employer later. I had to really sit down and work with organizers and working with the client to see if there were different ways that they could approach the issue in ways that was more meaningful for them. And so working at BWC has really been a transformative experience for me. And I think that everyone in this room is committed to helping, making a difference. And one of the things I wrestled with was how could I use my practice of law to make a difference? And I think working there showed me that serving as a collaborator as opposed to a traditional lawyer and what law teaches you to do is really effective.
Thank you. I wanted to invite folks on the panel to either respond to anything that has been said, and also, I wanted to just ask if you could, if it segues with those comments, to talk a little bit about why it's been important to build the center as a separate entity from the Labor Center and what that movement, what the intention was behind it and how it sort of fits into the model of lawyering that Delvin talked about, to the experience that the workers have had, and to what the overall sort of vision is, I guess I would say. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
the Worker Center, as I mentioned, is about building power, right? It's our theory of social change is that the way in which we can transform this economy to one where Black workers can thrive, where families and communities are sustained and vibrant, is that Black workers have to have power, and they have to have power, and by power we mean certainly they need to have numbers, but they have to have expertise, they have to have networks, they have to be willing to also engage in activities that disrupt the status quo and what's happening and make the issues of Black work prioritized, right, in the society and by decision makers. And so, disruption and building power is not necessarily in the mission statement of UCLA. And I know if any students are in the house, any faculty that have been organizing, we all know that there's a limit to what you can do within a university framework. And the idea is that the Worker Center would really join a constellation of about 300 community-based worker institutions, worker centers, if you will, across the country that have emerged in the last 25 years, really in response to union organizing that has really excluded or not prioritized particular populations of workers, be they immigrant workers or women or Black workers. And the feeling is that we have we have power in our own communities to defend, represent, support, develop strategies that could advance workers. And so, when we sort of the vision for the Worker Center is that the Worker Center is an independent institution that is governed by worker leaders who are setting the agenda, and they have the power to move that agenda forward. And you know, I think part of the experiment that we were able to do at UCLA in supporting the development of the Worker Center is that now there are 8 Black Worker Centers across the country, and a growing network of worker centers that are stepping in the gap of sort of the legacy urban leagues and the legacy NAACP, but going back to the traditional Black power movements where individual grassroots leaders make the decision to change the conditions that they are experiencing, and they move that forward. And we need all sorts of expertise to be able to do that, right? You know, we're conductors, you know, we're organizers, we need lawyers, we need policy folks, we need researchers, we need wellness, we need culture workers. The movement that we are building around Black work is broad and deep. And our vision is, you know, long-term, how do we make this, you know, an equitable economy for Black folks and their families?
Thank you. Noah or Carlos, Delvin, any thoughts on this question, like why the center as a distinct entity or a distinct space?
Well, I mean, I guess one thing I'll just chime in, building on what Lola was saying. I mean, worker centers of a variety of sorts tend to be independent nonprofits or co-ops, depending on the particulars. But I mean, part of what's been so important and exciting about the Worker Center movement generally, and really important to have the Black Worker Center kind of come into that space, has been, you know, there's this dynamic of kind of the limits and exclusions of the traditional labor movement, and there's also tremendous limits on American labor law generally. And so worker centers I think of as kind of emerging against the backdrop of, on the one hand, problems of exclusion, especially for low-wage workers of color from the labor movement, but also against the limits that the labor movement has really been struggling with over the past 20 years. And so part of what's so exciting about worker centers is this sort of kind of more holistic model that Lola was just describing, which isn't exclusively focused on getting a majority of workers in a single workplace to then collectively bargain with the employer, which is the traditional union model. Not that there's a problem with that, but there's real barriers to doing it. But there's other ways to exercise power by making linkages between workers across different workplaces with different employers, by drawing on the power of public protest, by mobilizing political power, especially in cities like Los Angeles that are more accessible to low-income communities of color than like national or state politics might be. And from the legal perspective, leveraging creative ways of using a variety of areas of law, including employment law, whether it's about wage and hour law or employment discrimination law, and thinking about those things as technically being individual claims, but things that can be done in concert with organizing in ways that create leverage that can be used for other aims, that can be done in a group, and that can involve workers themselves in the process of monitoring and enforcing rights in the way that Lola was describing. One of the really innovative things about the Black Worker Center has been this idea of kind of worker-led monitoring of compliance, rather than thinking of that as being something that you kind of leave up to the state or the government to do on its own.
Mr. Landers, did you have any, you mentioned the Me Too movement and its inspiration for you. Can you say a little more about that, like why you drew, the strength that you say you drew from it? How did it speak to you?
It let me know that that when things happen and you say something and no one listens to you, you have to keep talking, and eventually someone will listen. And when that happens, then everyone listens.
Delvin, did you have anything?
Yeah, I'm building off of what Professor Zatz and everyone said before. I think one of the values of the Worker Center is that it helps give people, everyday people, a voice and a sense of empowerment to take over responsibility and see how they can play a role in making the type of change that they want to see in their communities. I think a lot of the work around lawyering is sort of how can I use my skills to effectuate change. But at the Black Worker Center, it's sort of how can we work together and how can everyone play a role in making change, positive change for their communities. So I think that giving people a sense of ownership in the process incentivizes them to take a stand, to join in the causes that we all want to address, but secretly don't think we have the potential to address.
One of the things that I think maybe Noah, you alluded to, and to some extent Lola, is the situation for Black workers in LA relative to the traditional ways of thinking about the workforce in LA as an immigrant workforce. Mm-hmm. And I know that many people have talked about over time the changing demographics of the city, the way in which certain areas like the Crenshaw area, Lola, that you were talking about, that were historically Black and are no longer, how that impacts the sort of conditions of work and how that bifurcation or that divide of sort of thinking about immigrant workers on the one hand and to be candid, the way in which sometimes the Black worker is just kind of disappeared. Mm-hmm. If you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me about that, I think the reality of the Black-Brown tension that's often discussed, but in our movement, what we've come to realize is that there is, again, systems at work that create these tensions, right? So I think about the Black janitors, for example. So, janitors in Los Angeles in the 1970s were almost 80% unionized. They were making about $17 an hour. They had been part of since the 1940s and the New Deal of organizing and building power and creating a level and a standard of living in that industry. Fast forward to the 1990s, right, and it's a largely undocumented immigrant population that's making cash under the table, about $3 to $5 an hour, and an enormous Justice for Janitors movement created to go back and to organize those workers. I think the story of the janitors lifts up a challenge, but also the opportunity, and one is the challenge of the labor movement to not have a race and capitalism framework to address the needs of Black janitors in the 1970s and what was happening to those janitors. And the absence of that allowed the market to completely dismantle any sort of worker protections and rights and a standard of living, and created, a poverty job that then took, another 20 years to unionize under the Justice for Janitors banner. And so what we understand is that poor Black and brown immigrant folks don't have the power to address the Black jobs crisis. That it is corporate decisions, it is business practices, and it is a very targeted and clear business plan and strategy to undermine quality work by displacing workers, and what we often say, excluding workers, right? So locking some workers out and then locking some workers in, locking them into slave wages, slave environments, and slave work. And part of our analysis and education is that we have to step back and see that structure that's at play, and we have to fight both the exclusion and the exploitation of workers, which means Black folk need to organize with immigrant folk, and immigrant folk need to organize with Black folks to stop this cycle of exploitation and exclusion and break that link. I think we know that's very hard to do because the narrative is someone is hardworking and someone is not, right? And we have to create spaces for workers to unpack that and to build power around our shared experiences in this economy. And how do we push for a janitorial industry that has both Black and immigrant workers? How do we push for a construction industry that has both female and Black and immigrant workers? The pie is big enough for everyone to get a slice. We just have to ensure that the folks that control the resources understand that we will not allow other communities to be undercut. And one of the ways to do that is through policy, right? One of the ways to do that is through ensuring that there are enforcement practices. And so I talked about the project labor agreement, which the Black Worker Center was able to win, and we won it with deep support from the Clean Car Wash campaign, which is like immigrant car wash workers who came and testified that Black folks should be building the Crenshaw line, right? And our folks were out there on the picket line shutting down, car washes that were robbing, Salvadorian car washeros of their wages, right? We like fighting together, but we won that agreement. And part of that agreement was to say that we have to police these construction sites, that we can't allow Metro to simply say, we're gonna make sure that you're taken care of. Our members were like, no, we need to be at the construction sites. We need to have our binoculars. We need to be out there counting workers. And when we started our grassroots enforcement, as Metro was collecting their data on the workforce, we were also collecting our data on the workforce. And through the effort, what we did was we changed the numbers from 0% Black workers on the project to about 20% Black workers on the project in just two years. And I want to make sure you understand why 20% is important. When we started the construction campaign, Black workers were 2% on every construction project, large scale, publicly funded in the city of Los Angeles, just 2%. And through that tireless monitoring, we were able to grow that to 20%. And so we know that enforcement matters. We know that Black workers coming together and presenting those solutions make a difference. And we know that we can't win this alone. We have to do this with immigrant workers, with Black workers, with women who are part of the Me Too movement. We have to challenge these systems and create new mechanisms for workers to be able to get the justice that they seek. And I wanted to just, and I know I'm talking a lot, but I want to say for Delvin's point, I think what Delvin mentioned is really, really important, that it is a collaboration, and it is the creativity of ideas. It is, with Noah's analysis, us really trying to look at ways to stretch the law, right? To get it to contort and to bend in ways that will actually support and help workers. And it takes all of us to make that possible.
Thank you. Delvin, you mentioned about how the Workers Center challenged you to think about lawyering in a different way. I'm wondering if you could say something about one of the projects that you've been working on, and particularly with reference to this question of enforcement, and sort of thinking about different models of enforcement as another kind of innovation that maybe comes out of some of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so one of the projects that I helped or have been working on with the Black Worker Center, when I started, they were in the midst of trying to pass SB 491 to really get the local government to enforce anti-discrimination laws. Currently, the state government is only allowed to enforce employment discrimination laws. So SB 491 was a way to advocate for local governments being involved so that employees could feel or could have remedies at their disposal that they don't currently have in California. And I think this project was really meaningful to me because I got to see how different people who I admire, like Professor Zatz and Professor Harris, were also working on the ground to effectuate change. And in doing so, we all went up to the state to lobby to help pass SB 491, and that's something that you don't really get exposure into projects like that are trying to make direct and immediate change. And so for me, I think that's one of the reasons I sort of came to law school. I grew up, in a low-income background. And I worked as a youth counselor after finishing college, and I really wanted to find ways that I could use my skills and experiences to make a difference, to make a better difference in communities that I served and I grew up in. And I think that working on a project like SB 491 to pass local enforcement of anti-discrimination showed me how we can work in different ways to help bring about change. So that project was particularly meaningful.
So, Mr. Landers, you talked about the now nearly 20-year class action case that you've been involved in.
Yes.
And it's sort of a reminder to all of us that the life of the law is very long. The end is sometimes very far out of sight. But along the way, apart from, obviously the kind of toll that this kind of litigation can actually take on a person individually, can you say something about some of the maybe ways in which the Worker Center helped you think about or see your relationship to that case or any of the controversies around that case differently than you would have been had you just kind of been dealing with it on your own?
Well, I was going to give up. I was just going to take a medical and not deal with it. But then when I got with the Black Workers Center, it reminded me that other peoples came before me and stood up for me to get to where I am. And so I figured there's a younger generation, and maybe I need to do the same thing, stand up, so that maybe they don't have to deal with that.
Do we have time for a few questions? So if there are questions, comments, now's the time. Yes, Tendai.
Thank you so much for the best Valentine's Day present ever. It's just, I feel so fortunate to hear from the range of speakers that we've heard from. So I want to pick up on something that you said, Lola, that I think is really powerful, which is the idea of connecting, or the necessity of connecting what's happening today to historical projects of racialized labor exploitation. And I think you're absolutely right to say that racialized labor exploitation is an age-old global project, and arguably one of the most successful, if not the most successful. And in hearing you talk about the amazing work you're doing here in Los Angeles and the work that Black Worker Centers are doing across the country, I'm curious about your thoughts on whether this can or maybe even is a global project of resistance, right? So the racialized labor exploitation is global. One would imagine that the resistance has to be global as well, and that would be aided by transnational communication among people like yourselves who are doing this work elsewhere. So I'm curious to hear what connections you have with people in other parts of the world, and whether you see that as urgent, important, or whether it really can be a fight that is successfully waged at the local and the national level only.
Thank you for that question. In my opinion and my vantage point, I feel that power is built locally, and that through that local power and through those small but growing victories, we begin to connect with other movements and relationships. But at the Black Worker Center, we do understand the best practice, the knowledge sharing, the ways in which communities are making a difference. So one of our staff members recently went to Brazil and spent some time talking with some of the Black Lives Matter folks in Brazil about the work that we're doing in LA. We're planning to do a Cuba delegation to look at this whole idea of cooperative economics as a national Black Worker Center, and to see, what are the ways we can learn from some of the alternative economy strategies that are at play in Cuba. And so, we read a lot, looking at other worker experiences in South Africa. So we do see this, this global community as one that is fighting, and Black people around the globe are fighting the same forces, the same systems, the same structures, the same anti-Blackness, and what are the ways that we can learn from each other's struggles and share that struggles. But first, we have to build power in our own backyard. We have to build a power in a way that, every victory, SB 491 is not the end, right? This is about practice. How do we continue to practice and expand and build our base to make critical change? So when the global movement is ready, we are prepared, right, for that work. And so I think that's kind of our approach to looking at the Black worker movement through a global lens.
Anyone else? Yes, right here in the middle.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak to if the Black Worker Center is doing work for artists in the Los Angeles community. Like, I know that there's a huge dance scene here. There's a lot of actors in Los Angeles, and that there's a history within that community of them being underpaid or not paid for work, for them being asked to pay for auditions, to even be seen for auditions, to get opportunities. And I was wondering if any of your work speaks to artists.
So at the Worker Center, we have a very broad definition for workers. We aren't industry specific, so unemployed workers, unionized workers, workers who are underemployed are all part of our community, and we have supported workers. One of our main victories that came out of our clinic work in the summer was representing a woman who worked for Sony, who was discriminated against and also faced wage theft, right? So the links between the exploitation and the exclusion. And we were able to support her through her case and to win her back wages and to help set up a very successful lawsuit that she was able to move forward. And so, we don't limit our work, but we do sort of look at where are the growth industries, and the entertainment industry is the third largest and is a growing industry in Los Angeles, and it's one. I don't know if folks are familiar with Professor Darnell Hunt's research, just looking at the Writers Guild and the challenges of writers of color in Hollywood, and we've done some work to support some of his projects as well. But we don't limit any worker who comes to the Black Worker Center, because these conditions are systemic, and it might be a different industry, but similar conditions that workers face across the board.
Right here?
I guess I would like to hear more about the relationship that the Worker Center has with local labor unions, if at all, just because the two of them do try to restructure power for labor, definitely in different ways. So I guess specifically now the Black Worker Center, if they have any sort of relationship, but also more generally what any of y'all believe the kind of interaction between unions and worker centers will eventually evolve to.
Want to go first?
Okay. So the LA Black Worker Center is probably one of the few centers that was really rooted in a Black trade unionist model. So, though we talk a lot about immigrant worker organizing, Black workers are the largest organized group of workers in LA County, many of them working for the city, the county, and the state. And so, those union leaders who have enjoyed collective bargaining rights have supported the notion that too often they are the only ones with good jobs in their neighborhoods and in their families, and they're supporting Tyrone, their nephew, and the grandbaby, and they're keeping the lights on because they do have quality work while everyone else is in this crisis, right, around work. And so they were very supportive of lending political power to the Black Worker Center, capacity to the Black Worker Center. I think historically, though, there's been some challenges with building a united labor movement. I think there is probably at the in the 80s, and Victor Naro, who's with us, is one of the experts on this issue of worker centers and helped to really define the term worker centers. But in my estimation is there was a confusion as they came onto the worker organizing scene, and unions wondering, are they competing with us, right, to take workers from our organizing, or are they working collaboratively? And I think over probably the last 5 to 8 years, there's been tremendous alignment with unions recognizing the value of having community-based organizations that are focused on transforming the economy and building worker power, and doing it in less institutionalized but more democratic ways that's really building authentic power in community around work. I think unions are also appreciating that worker centers are operating on like a fraction of the budget, but are able to really transform work and win agreements that make a difference in using really creative strategies, right? And so I think that recognition and the hard work of Worker Center has transformed the relationship. But as we emerge as a Black Worker Center, I think the labor movement still struggles with moving beyond just class to see race and class as interlinked. And so, I think we continue to have conversations about why a Black Worker Center and why is it important to see work as racialized and to think of our strategies, right, through that lens. So we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. And we can share more about some of those experiences and battles too.
Can I just add one brief,
Sorry, go ahead.
just one brief, footnote to that, which is that, historically there's a dynamic relationship between worker centers and labor unions, which is to say, very often there'll be a group of workers or an occupation which isn't being organized, and a worker center will step up, and then after the worker center steps up, then the labor movement gets more interested, and then there's a question of where that goes. But there's been a lot of situations which have a collaboration has emerged, but it emerged because the worker center went first, and then the labor movement was catching up.
Jesseline?
Thank you so much. I want to echo Professor Chimmy's remarks that this is a wonderful Valentine's Day gift, that all of you bring so much passion to your work, and it feels so hard to see all of you here today. I have two quick questions. One for Mr. Landers. You have a room full of aspiring lawyers, many of whom want to do work in social justice and movement lawyering. And having worked with lawyers, do you have any advice for students who want to create social change and who want to work with community members and organizers and workers, and what advice you would give these students? And I also have a question for Delvin. Delvin, I've heard through the grapevine that you are working on a project with the Black Worker Center to get more students involved. If you could tell us a little bit about that project and what you are doing.
Just never give up. And it's a struggle. It's a struggle it's a struggle for me as well. Just don't never give up. We appreciate the help. I appreciate any help that I get. I'm appreciating it. So if you're a lawyer, just don't give up.
Yeah, so in recognizing that we need everyone's help, we're actually forming an employment discrimination clinic with BWC, UCLA, and Legal Aid at Work, so that we can specifically address this need. In the clinic, we're happy to announce we'll be doing a soft launch in April and a formal launch in the fall. And the students here, there's really an opportunity to get involved with this. We need leaders for the fall. We need regular volunteers, especially in this time when there are less resources devoted to this specific issue. I think you all have the chance, and we all have the chance to really give back and to help these workers. And so I've been privileged to work on this project, the second project, with BWC and CRS and Legal Aid at Work.
If people want more information, are there any people that they should contact?
My email address should be on the biography, right?
Delvin is very modest.
Yes, he is.
He's been a tireless and creative and really visionary worker in this area, and we have tasked him with many memos and questions regarding how this can be set up, what can be done. And in case you're wondering, well, what does this mean? What does the clinic look like? What is it going to do? Understand that we are very much in the process of thinking a lot of these questions through. And what our model is to think about, beginning with Lola's sort of description and Delvin's description of the collaborative nature of the project. This is definitely a project where the student ideas and vision will be very much welcome and crucial to the success of the clinic. One of the things that I think comes out of my conversations and my opportunity to interact with the folks here is that never is it the case that somebody walks in the door and says, I have a retaliation case, right? Or I have a X case. And this is why what Delvin is talking about is so crucial, the ability to sit and listen. One of the things that becomes really important in this is to understand the interconnectedness of these problems and how they relate to people's living circumstances, what their family situations are, why in certain circumstances it may or may not be possible for them to file a direct complaint because of what that may trigger. So all of these things are areas where I think there are tremendous opportunities for your participation, not only in terms of helping, a constituency that very much is in need of help, but actually helping us become better at what we do, helping us become better lawyers. So with that, I think we're probably out of time, are we? Okay.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to actually say that we really want to thank everyone again. And before we leave, I really want to acknowledge one of our benefactors and supporters who's been really crucial in some of our initiatives here, and that is Erica Glazer. She's been really a great gift to us in terms of supporting some of the scholarship for our CRS students, and we look forward to our continued collaboration.